from the audience. Hey, Rain. This is the Reader's Nook. Don't mind my background. We are going to read the Tommyknockers. Book 2, Chapter 9, Part 20. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Thus we commit the body of our friend Ruth McCausland to the ground, her whole and her soul to a loving God. The mourners had moved on to the pretty little graveyard on the hill west of the village. They stood loosely gathered around an open grave. Ruth's casket was suspended over it on runners. There were far fewer mourners here than there had been in the church. Many of the out-of-towners, either headachy or nauseated, or glowing feverishly with strange new ideas, had taken the chance afforded by the intermission between acts to slip away. The flowers at the head of the grave ruffled gently in a fresh summer breeze. As Reverend Goeringer raised his head, he saw a bright yellow rose go twirling down the grassy hill. Beyond and below homeland's weather-beaten white fence, he could see the town hall clock tower. It wavered slightly in the bright air, like something seen through a heat haze. Still, Goeringer, the best magic lantern. Goeringer thought it was a damn good illusion. These strangers in town had seen the best magic lantern slide in history and didn't even know it. His eyes met Frank Spruce's for just an instant. He read relief clearly in Frank's eyes, and he supposed Frank could see it just as clearly in his own. Many of the outsiders would go back to wherever they came from and tell their friends that Ruth's death had rocked the little community to its foundations. They had hardly seemed to be there at all. What none of them knew, Goeringer reflected, was that they had been following the events near the ship with most of their attention. For a while, things out there had gone very badly. Now they were under control again, but Bobbi Anderson might die. They couldn't get her back to the shed in time, and that was bad. Still, things were under control. The becoming would continue. That was the only important consideration. Goeringer held his Bible open in one hand. Excuse me. Its pages fluttered a little in the wind. Now he raised the other hand in the air. The mourners, standing around Ruth's grave, lowered their heads. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift up his face and make it shine upon you, give you peace. And the mourners raised their heads. Goeringer smiled. There'll be refreshments in the library for those of you who'd care to stop by for a while and remember Ruth, he said. Act 2 was over. "21. Kyle reached gently into Bobbi's pants pocket and probed until he found her keyring. He worked it out, picked through the keys, and found the one that opened the padlock to on the shed door. He inserted the key in the lock, but didn't turn it. Adley and Joe Somerville were covering Dugan, who was still behind the wheel of the Jeep, which was finding it harder and harder to pull air from the mask. The needle on the supply dial had been in the red for 5 minutes now. Kyle rejoined them. Go check the trunk, Kyle said to Joe Summerfield. Looks like he's still passed out, but I don't trust the fucker. Joe crossed the side yard, climbed the porch, and examined Gardner carefully, wincing at his sour breath. This time, there really was no sham. Gardner had gotten a fresh bottle of scotch and had drunk himself into oblivion. As the two other men stood waiting for Joe to come back, Kyle said, Bobbi is most likely going to die, and if she does, I'm going to get rid of that lush first thing. Joe came back. He's out. Kyle nodded and turned the key in the shed's padlock as Joe joined Adley in keeping the cop covered. Kyle pulled the lock free and opened the door part way. Brilliant green light poured out. It was so bright it seemed to dim the sunlight. There was an odd liquid churning sound. It was almost, but not quite, the sound of machinery. Kyle took an involuntary step backward, his face tightening momentarily into an expression of fright, revulsion, and awe. The smell alone, thick and bedded and organic, was damn near enough to knock a man over. Kyle understood, they all did, that the two-hearted nature of the Tommyknockers was now growing together. The dance of deception was nearly done. Liquid churning sounds, that smell, and then another sound, something like a feeble bubbly yap of a drowning dog. Kyle had been in the shed twice before, but remembered little about it. He knew, of course, that it was an important place, a fine place, and that it had speeded his own becoming. And becoming is always in parentheses. But the human part of him was still almost superstitiously afraid of it. He came back to Adley and Joe. We can't wait for the others. We've got to get Bobbi in there right now, if there's going to be any chance of saving her at all. The cop he saw had taken off the mask. It lay used up on the seat beside him. That was good. As Adley had said, out in the woods, he would think less about escaping without his canned air. Keep your gun on the cop, Kyle said. Joe, help me with Bobbi. Help you take her into the shed? No, help me take her into the Rumford Zoo so she can see the fucking lion, Kyle shouted. Of course the shed. I don't think I want to go in there. Not just now. Joe looked from the green light back to Kyle. A shamed, slightly thickened smile on his lips. I'll help you, Adley said softly. Bobbi's a good old sport. Be a shame if she croaked before we got to the end of it. All right, Kyle said. Cover the cop, said to Joe. And if you screw up, I swear to God, I'll kill you. I won't, Kyle, Joe said. That shamed grin still hung on his mouth, but there was no mistaking the relief in his eyes. I sure won't. I'll watch him good. See that you do, Bobbi said feebly. It startled them all. Kyle looked at her, then back at Joe. Joe flinched away from the naked contempt in Kyle's eyes. But he didn't look toward the shed, toward that light, those churning, squelching sounds. Come on, Adley. Hey. I was reading. What's up? Alright, what's up? Yeah, I'm gonna do that. That was part of my plan tonight. No, I think he's upstairs. Alright, I'll talk to you soon. Alright, bye. Where the heck? Oh, squelching. Okay. Come on, Adley, Kyle said at last. Let's get Bobbi in there. Soon as started soonest done. Adley McKean, 50-ish, balding and stocky, flagged for only a moment. Is it? He licked his lips. Kyle, is it bad in there? I don't really remember, Kyle said. All I know is I felt wonderful when I came out. Like I knew more. Could do more. Oh, Adley said in an almost non-existent voice. You'll be one of us, Adley, Bobbi said, in that same feeble voice. Adley's face, although still frightened, firmed up again. All right, he said. Let's try not to hurt her, Kyle said. They got Bobbi into the shed. Joe Summerfield turned his attention briefly away from Dugan to watch them disappear into that glow, and it seemed to him that they really did disappear rather than just step inside. It was like watching objects disappear into a dazzling corona. His lapse was brief, but it was all the old Butch Dugan would have needed. Even now, he saw the opportunity. He was simply unable to use it. No strength in his legs, turning nausea in his stomach. His head thudded and pounded. I don't want to go in there. Nothing he could do about it if they decided to drag him in, though. He was as weak as a kitten. He drifted. After a while, he heard voices and raised his head. It took an effort because it seemed as if someone had poured cement into one of his ears until his head was full of it. The rest of the posse, pulling out of the tangle that was Bobbi Anderson's garden. They were shoving the old man roughly along. Hillman's feet tangled and he fell down. One of them, Tarkington, kicked him to his feet. And Butch got the run of Tarkington's thoughts clearly. He was outraged at what he thought of as the murder of Beach Jernigan. Hillman stumbled on toward the Cherokee. Shed door opened then. Kyle Arkenberg and Adley McKean came out. McKean no longer looked frightened. His eyes were glowing, and his big toothless grin stretched his lips. That wasn't all. Something else. Then Butch realized. In the few minutes the two men had been inside there, a large portion of Adley McKean's hair appeared to have disappeared. I'll go in any time, Kyle, he was saying. No problem. There was more. But now everything wanted to drift away again. Butch let it. The world dimmed out until there was nothing left but those churning sounds and the after image of green light on his eyelids. 22. Act 3. They sat in the town library. The name would be changed to the Ruth McCausland Memorial Library, all agreed. They drank coffee, iced tea, Coca-Cola, ginger ale. They drank nothing that was alcoholic. Not at Ruth's wake. They ate tiny triangle tuna fish sandwiches. They ate similar ones containing a taste of cream cheese and olives. They ate sandwiches containing a taste of cream cheese and pimento. They ate cold cuts and a jello salad with shreds of carrot suspended in it like fossils in amber. They talked a great deal, but the room was mostly silent. If it had been bugged, the listeners would have been disappointed. The tension had drawn many faces tight in the church as the situation in the woods teetered on the dangerous verge of careering out of control, had now smoothed out. Bobbi was in the shed. That nosy Parker of an old man had been taken in. Last of all, the nosy Parker policeman had been taken into the shed. The group mind lost track of these people as they went into the thick, corroded brass glow of that green light. They ate and drank and listened, talked. No one said a word. That was all right. The last of the outsiders had left town, following Goringer's graveside benediction, and they had haven to themselves again. Will it be all right now? Yes, they'll understand about Dugan. Are you sure? Yes, they will understand. They will think they understand. The tick of the Seth Thomas on the mantelpiece donated by the grammar school after last year's spring bottle and can drive, was the loudest sound in the room. Occasionally there was a decorous clink of a china cup. Faintly beyond the open screen windows, the sound of a faraway airplane. No birdsong. It was not missed. They ate and drank, and when Dugan was escorted from Bobby's shed around 1:30 that afternoon, they knew. People rose, and now real talk, began all at once. Tupperware bowls were capped. Uneaten sandwiches were popped into baggies. Claudette Reval, Ashley's mother, put a piece of aluminum foil over the remains of the casserole she had brought. They all went outside and headed toward their homes, smiling and chatting. Act 3 was over. 23. Gardner came to around sundown with a hangover headache and a feeling that things had happened which he could not quite remember. Finally made it, Guard, he thought. Finally had yourself another blackout. Satisfied? He managed to get off the porch and to walk shakily around the corner of the house, out of view of the road, before throwing up. He saw blood in the vomit and wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time, although there was more blood this time than ever before. Dreams, Christ. He'd had some weird nightmares, blackout or no. People out here, coming and going, so many people that all they needed was a brass band and a Dallas police. The Dallas police were out here this morning. You got drunk so you wouldn't see them, you fucking coward. Cowgirl's nightmares, that was all. He turned away from the puddle of puke between his feet. The world was wavering in and out of focus with every bit of his heart. And Gardner suddenly knew that he was edged very close to death. He was committing suicide after all, just doing it slowly. He put his arm against the side of the house, forehead on his arm. Mr. Gardner, are you all right? Huh? He cried, jerked upright. His heart slammed 2 violent beats, stopped for what seemed forever, and then began to beat so rapidly he could barely distinguish the individual pulses. His headache suddenly cranked up to overload. He whirled. Bobbi Tremaine stood there, looking surprised, even a little amused, but not really sorry for the scare he had given Gardner. Gee, I didn't mean to creep up on you, Mr. Gardner. Fucking well did, and I fucking well know it. The Tremaine kid blinked rapidly several times. He had caught some of that, Gardner saw. He found he didn't give a shit. Where's Bobby? He asked. I know who you are. I know where you are. Right in front of me. Where's Bobby? Well, I'll tell you, Bobbi Tremaine said. His face became very open, very wide-eyed, very honest, and Gardner was suddenly forcibly reminded of his teaching days. This was how students who had spent the long winter weekend skiing, screwing, and drinking looked when they started to explain that they couldn't turn in their research papers today because their mothers had died on Saturday. Sure, tell me, Gardner said. Gardner leaned against the clapboard side of the house, looking at the teenager in the reddish glow of sunset. Over his shoulder, he could see the shed, padlocked, its windows boarded up. The shed had been in the dream, he remembered. Dream, whatever it is you don't want to admit it was real. For a moment, the kid looked genuinely disconcerted by Gardner's cynical expression. Anderson had a sunstroke. Some of the men found her near the ship and took her to Derry Home Hospital. You were passed out. Gardner straightened up quickly. Is she all right? I don't know. They're still with her. No one has called here, not since 3 o'clock or so anyway. That's when I got out here. Gardner pushed away from this building and started around the house, head down, working against the hangover. He had believed the kid was going to lie, and perhaps he had lied about the nature of what had happened to Bobby, but Gardner sensed a core of truth in what the kid said. Bobby was sick, hurt, something. It explained those dreamlike comings and goings, he remembered. He supposed Bobbi had called them with her mind. Sure. Called them with her mind. Neatest trick of the week. Only in Haven, ladies and germs. Where are you going? Tremaine asked, his voice suddenly very sharp. Derry. Gardner had reached the head of the driveway. Bobby's pickup was parked there. The Tremaine kid's big yellow Dodge Charger was pulled in next to it. Gardner turned back toward the kid. The sunset had painted harsh red highlights and black shadows on the boy's face, making him look like an Indian. Gardner took a closer look and realized he wasn't going anywhere. This kid, fast car, and football hero's shoulders, hadn't been put out here just to give Guard the bad news as soon as Guard managed to throw off enough of the booze to rejoin the living. Am I supposed to believe Bobbi was out there in the woods, excavating away like a madwoman, and she keeled over with a heat stroke? There we go. Heat stroke while her sometime partner was lying back on the porch drunk as a coot. That it? Well, that's a good trick, because she was supposed to be at the McCausland woman's funeral. She went into the village, and I was out here alone, and I started thinking about what I saw Sunday. Started thinking, and then started drinking, which is mostly the way it works with me. Of course, Bobbi could have gone to the funeral, come back here, changed, gone out in the woods to work, and then had sunstroke. Except that isn't what happened. Kid's lying. It's written all over his face. And all of a sudden, I'm very fucking glad he can't read my thoughts. I think Miss Anderson would rather have you stay here and keep on with the work, Bobbi Tremaine said evenly. You think? That is, we all think. The kid looked momentarily more disconcerted than ever. Wary, a bit rocky on his feet. Didn't expect Bobby's pet drunk to have any teeth or claws left, I guess. That kicked off another, more queerer thought, and he looked at the kid more closely, in the light, which was now fading into orange and ashy pink. Football hero's shoulders, a handsome cleft chin face that might have been drawn by Alex Gordon or Bernie Wrightston. Deep chest, narrow wrist, Bobbi Tremaine, All-American. No wonder the Colson girl was nuts over him. But that sunken, infirm-looking mouth went oddly with the rest, Gardner thought. They were the ones who kept losing teeth, not Gardner. Okay, what's he here for? Guard me to make sure I stay put, no matter what? Well, all right, he said to Tremaine, in a softer, more conciliatory voice. If that's what you all think. Tremaine relaxed a little. It really is. Well, let's go in and put on the coffee. I could use some. My head aches, and we'll have to get going early in the morning. He stopped and looked at Tremaine. You are going to help, aren't you? That's part of it, isn't it? Yes, sir. Gardner nodded. He looked at the shed for a moment, and in the fading light he could see brilliant green tattooed in the small spaces between the boards. For a moment his dream shimmered almost within his grasp. Deadly shoemakers hammering away at unknown devices in that green glare. He had never seen the glow as bright as this before, and he noticed that when Tremaine glanced in that direction his eyes skittered away uneasily. The lyric of an old song floated, not quite randomly, into Gardner's mind, and then out again. Don't know what you're doing, but they laugh a lot behind the green door. Green door. What's that secret you're keeping? And there was a sound, faint, rhythmic, not at all identifiable, but somehow unpleasant. The two of them had faltered. Now Gardner moved on toward the house. Tremaine followed him gratefully. Good, Gardner said, as if the conversation had never lagged. I can use some help. Bobbi figured we'd get get down to some sort of hatchway in about 2 weeks, that we'd be able to get inside. Yes, I know, Tremaine said without hesitation. But that was with two of us working. Oh, there'll always be someone else with you, Tremaine said and smiled openly. A chill rippled up Gardner's back. Oh, yes, you bet. Until Bobbi comes back. Until then, Tremaine agreed. Except he doesn't think Bobbi's going to be back. Ever. Come on, he said. Coffee. Then maybe some chow. Sounds good to me. They went inside, leading the shed to churn and mutter to itself in the growing dark. And as the sun disappeared, the stitching of green in the cracks grew brighter and brighter and brighter. A cricket hopped into the luminous pencil mark one of the cracks printed on the ground. Fell dead. Chapter 10. A Book of Days, Town Concluded. Part 1. Thursday, July 28th. Butch Dugan woke up in his own bed in Derry at exactly 3:05 a.m. He pushed back the covers and swung his feet out onto the floor. His eyes were wide and dazed, his face puffy with sleep. The clothes he had worn on his trip to Haven with the old man the day before were on the chair by his small desk. There was a pen in the breast pocket of the shirt. He wanted that pen. This seemed to be the only thought his mind would clearly admit. He got up, went to the chair, took the pen, tossed the shirt on the floor, sat down, and then just sat for several minutes, looking out into the darkness, waiting for the next thought. Butch had gone into Anderson's shed, but very little of him had come out. He seemed shrunken, lessened. He had no clear memories of anything. He could not have told a questioner his own middle name, and he did not at all remember being driven to the Haven-Troy town line in the Cherokee Hillman had rented, or sliding behind the wheel after Adley McKean got out and walked back to Kyle Arkenberg's Cadillac. He likewise did not remember driving back to Derry, yet all these things had happened. He had parked the Cherokee in front of the old man's apartment building, locked it, and then got into his own car. 2 blocks away, he had stopped long enough to drop the Jeep keys into a sewer. He went directly to bed and had slept until the alarm clock planted in his mind woke him up. Now some new switch clicked over. Butch blinked once or twice, opened a drawer, and drew out a pad of paper, and he wrote, I told people Tuesday night I couldn't go to her funeral because I was sick. That was true. But it was not my stomach. I was going to ask her to marry me. Kept putting it off. Afraid she'd say no. If I hadn't been scared, she might be alive now. With her dead, there doesn't seem to be anything to look forward to. I'm so sorry. I am sorry about this mess. He looked at the note over for a moment and then signed his name at the bottom, Anthony F. Dugan. He laid the pen and the note aside and went back to sit bolt upright and looking out the window. At last, another relay kicked over, the last relay. He got up, went to the closet. He ran the combination of the wall safe at the back and removed his .357 mag. He put the belt over his shoulder, went back to the desk and sat down. He thought for a moment, frowning, then got up, turned off the light in the closet, shut the closet door, went back to the desk, sat down again, took the .357 from its holster. Trigger warning. put the muzzle of the gun firmly against his left eyelid, pulled the trigger. The chair toppled and hit the floor with a flat, undramatic wooden clap. The sound of a gallows trapdoor springing open. Front page, Bangor Daily News, Friday, July 28th. Derry State Policeman apparent suicide, in charge of trooper disappearance investigation by John Leandro. Corporal Anthony Butch Dugan of the Derry State Police Barracks apparently shot himself with a service revolver early Thursday morning. His death hit the Derry Barracks, which was rocked last week by the disappearance of 2 troopers. Hard indeed. 3. Saturday, July 30th. Gardner sat on a stump in the woods, his shirt off, eating a tuna and egg sandwich. That's the weirdest combination. And drinking iced coffee laced with brandy. Across from him, sitting on another stump, was John Enders, school principal. Enders was not built for hard work, and although it was only noon, he looked hot and tired and almost fagged out. Whatever that means. Garner nodded toward him. Not bad, he said. Better than Tremaine, anyway. Tremaine burnt water trying to boil it. Enders smiled wanly. Thank you. Gardner looked beyond him to the great circular shape jutting from the ground. The ditch kept widening, and they had to keep using more and more of that silvery netting, which somehow kept it from caving in. He had no idea how they made it, only knew that the large supply in the cellar had been almost depleted, and then yesterday, a couple of women from town had come out in the van with a fresh supply, neatly folded like freshly ironed curtains. They needed more because they kept taking away more and more of the hillside. And still, the thing continued down. Bobby's whole house could now have fit into its shadow. He looked at Enders again. Enders was looking at it with an expression of adoring religious awe, as if he were a rube druid, and this was his first trip from the boonies to see Stonehenge. Gardner got up, staggering slightly. Come on, he said. Let's do a little blasting. He and Bobby had reached a point weeks earlier where the ship was as tightly embedded in dour bedrock as a piece of steel and concrete. The bedrock hadn't hurt the ship, hadn't put so much as a scratch on its pearl gray hull, let alone dented or crushed it. But it was tightly plugged. The plug had to be blasted away. It would have been a job for a construction crew who understood how to use dynamite, a lot of dynamite, under other circumstances. But there was explosive available in Haven these days that made dynamite obsolete. Gardner still wasn't clear on what the explosion in Haven Village had been, and wasn't sure he ever wanted to be clear on it. It was a moot point anyway, because no one was talking. Whatever it had been, he was sure that some huge piece of brickwork had taken off like a rocket, and some of those new and improved explosions had been involved. There had been a time, he remembered, when he had actually wasted time speculating on whether or not the super brain food Bobby's artifact was putting into the air could produce weapons. That time now seemed incredibly distant, to Jim Gardner, incredibly naive. Can you make it, Johnny? He asked the school principal. Enders Jim Gardner, not John Gardner. Jim Gardner. Wait. Anders got up, wincing and putting his hands in the small of his back. He looked desperately tired, but he managed a small smile just the same. Looking at the ship seemed to refresh him. Blood was trickling from the corner of one eye, however, a single red tear. Something in there had ruptured. It's being this close to the ship, Gardner thought. On the first of the 2 days Bobbi Tremaine had spent helping him, he had spit out his last few teeth like machine gun bullets almost as soon as they got here. He thought of telling Anders that something behind his right eye was leaking, then decided to let him discover it on his own. The guy would be all right, probably. Even if he wasn't, Gardner wasn't sure he cared. This more than anything else shocked him. Why should it? Are you kidding yourself that these cats are human anymore? If you are, you better wise up, guard, old guard. He headed down the slope, stopping at the last stump before rocky soil gave way to chipped and runneled bedrock. He picked up the cheap transistor radio made of yellow, high-impact plastic. It looked like Snoopy. Attached to it was a board from a sharp calculator, and, of course, batteries. Humming, Gardner made his way down to the edge of the trench. There the music dried up and he was quiet, only staring at the titanic gray flank of the ship. The view did not refresh him, but it did inspire the deep awe which had overtones of steadily darkening fear. But you still hope to. You'd be a liar if you said you didn't. The key could still be here, somewhere. As the fear darkened, however, the hope did too. Soon he thought it would be gone. The hillside excavation now made the ship's flank too far away to touch. Not that he wanted to. He didn't enjoy the sensation of having his head turning into a very large speaker. It hurt. He rarely bled now when he did touch it, and touching it was sometimes inevitable. But the blast of radio always came, and on occasion his nose and ears could still spray a hell of a lot of blood, more blood than he cared to look at. Gardner wondered briefly just how much borrowed time he was now living on. But that question was also moot. From the morning he had awakened on that New Hampshire breakwater, it had all been borrowed time. He was a sick man and he knew it, but not too sick to appreciate the irony of the situation in which he found himself. After busting his hump to dig this fucker up with a variety of tools which looked as if they might have come out of the Hugo Gernsback Whole Universe catalog, after doing what the rest of them probably couldn't have done without working themselves to death in a kind of hypnotic trance, he might not be able to go inside when and if they came to the hatch Bobbi believed was there. But he meant to try. You could bet. Now he set his boot on the rope stirrup, slid the knot tight, and put the Snoopy radio in his shirt. Let me down easy, Johnny. Anders began to turn a windlass, and Gardner began to slide downward. Beside him, the smooth gray hull slid up and up and up. If they wanted to get rid of him, this would be as easy as any, he supposed. Just send a telepathic order to Anders. Let go of the wheel, John. We're through with him. And down he would plunge, 40 feet to the solid bedrock at the bottom. Black rope trailing up behind him. Crunch. But of course, he was at their mercy somehow, mercy anyhow, and he supposed they recognized his usefulness, however reluctantly. The Tremaine kid was young, strong as a bull, but he had fagged out in 2 days. Enders was going to last out today, maybe, but Gardner would have bet his watch and chain. What watch and chain? Haha. That there would be somebody else out here tomorrow to keep tabs on him. Bobbi was okay. Bullshit she was. If they hadn't come back, she would have killed herself. But she hung in there better than Enders and the Tremaine kid. His mind returned exorably. Bobbi went into the shed with the others. Tremaine and Enders never did. At least, not that you ever saw. Maybe that's the difference. So what's in there? 10,000 angels dancing on the head of a pin? The ghost of Jane's Dean? The shroud of Torin? What? He didn't know. His foot touched down at the bottom. I'm down, he yelled. Ender's face, looking very small, appeared at the edge of the cut. Beyond Gardner could see a tiny wedge of blue sky. Too tiny. Claustrophobia whispered in his ear. A voice as rough as sandpaper. The space between the side of the ship and the wall covered with that high silvery netting was very narrow down here. Gardner had to move with great care to avoid touching the ship's side and setting off one of those brain bursts. The bedrock was very dark. He squatted.
What was for dinner?
Fend for yourself, I had chili.
Okay.
So have some chili. He squatted and ran his fingers over it. They came away wet. They had come away a little wetter each day for the last week. That morning, he had cut a small square 4 inches on the side and a foot on to the floor of the bedrock, using a gadget that had once been a blow dryer. Now he opened his toolkit, removed his flashlight, and shone the light into it. Water down there. He got to his feet and screamed, "Send down the hose." What? Drifted down. Ender sounded apologetic. Sounded apologetic. Gardner sighed, drag of exhaustion. All this Hugo Gersbach old universe equipment, and no one thought to rig an intercom between up there and down here. Said they were screaming their throats out. Oh, but none of their bright ideas ran in that direction. You know it. Why would they think about intercoms when they could read thoughts? You're the horse and buggy human here, not them. The hose, he shrieked. Send down the motherfucking hose, Riphead. Oh, okay. Riphead? Gardner stood waiting for the hose to come down, wishing miserably that he was anywhere else in the world than here, wishing he could convince himself all of it only a nightmare. It was no good. The ship was madly erotic, but this reality was also too prosy to be a dream. An acrid smell of John Ender's sweat, slightly boozy smell of his own, the dig of the rope loop into his instep as he went down into the cut, the feel of rough, moist bedrock under his fingers. Where's Bodyguard? Is she dead? No, he didn't think she was dead, but he had become convinced that she was desperately ill. Something had happened to her on Wednesday. Something had happened to all of them on Wednesday. Gardner could not quite bring his memories into focus, but he knew there had been no real blackout or DT nightmare. It would have been better for him if there had been. There had been some sort of cover-up last Wednesday, a frantic cut and paste, and in the course of it, he believed that Bobbi had been hurt, taken ill, something. But they're not talking about it. Bobbi Tremaine. Bobbi, heck. Mr. Gardner. Nothing wrong with Bobbi. Just a little old heat stroke. She'll be back in no time. You can use the rest. You know it better. You know it better than anyone, I guess. It sounded great. So great you'd almost think that Tremaine kid believed it himself until you looked closely at his odd eyes. He could see himself going to those he was coming to think of as the shed people, demanding to know what had happened to her. Newt Barringer. Next thing you know, he'll be trying to tell us that we're the Dallas police. Boy, they'd think all, they'd sure all start to laugh then, wouldn't they? Them, the Dallas police, that was sure funny. That was a scream. Maybe Guard thought, that's why I feel so much like doing it. Screaming, I mean. Now he stood deep in this man-made crack in the earth. A crack that contained a titanic, alien, flying ship, waiting for the hose to come down. Suddenly, the final, horrible passage of George Orwell's Animal Farm clanged in his head like a death cry. It was strange. The things you discover you'd gotten by heart. Clover's old eyes flitted from one face to another, and as the animals outside looked from pig to man, man to pig, and pig to man again. Excuse me. It seemed that some strange thing was happening. It was impossible to say which was which. Jesus, Guard, cut it out. Here came the hose at last, 70-footer from the volunteer fire department. It was, of course, meant to spray water, not suck it up, but a vacuum pump had neatly reversed its function. Enders ate it out jerkily. The end swung back and forth, sometimes striking the hull of the ship. Boy. Each time this happened, there was a cludding sound that was dull yet curiously penetrating. Gardner didn't like it, and quickly came to anticipate each clud. Christ, I wish he hadn't got that thing swinging. Clud, clud, clud. Why can't it just clink? Why does it have to keep making that other sound like dirt being shoveled on top of a coffin? Clud, clud, clud. Christ, I should have jumped when I had the chance. Just stepped off that fucking breakwater at Arcadia Beach. July 4th, wasn't it? Shit. I could have been a Yankee Doodle Deeder. Well, go on then. When you go back to the house tonight, gobble all the Valium in the medicine cabinet. Kill yourself if you haven't got the guts to either see this thing through or put a stop to it. The good people of Haven will probably throw a party over your body. You think they want you here. There wasn't some of the old unimproved Bobbi still around. I think she'd have gone already. You'd be gone already. She wasn't standing between you and them. Bud. Was Bobbi still standing between him and the rest of Haven? Yeah. But if she died, how long would it be before he himself was scrubbed from the equation? Not long, buddy. Not long at all. Like maybe 15 minutes. Good Lord Almighty. This is one long section. Blood. Wincing teeth set against the dull, dead sound. Guard leapt up and caught the brass nozzle of the hose before it could rap against the side of the ship again. He pulled it down, knelt over the hole, and craned his head up at Ender's small face. Start the pump. He yelled. What? Jesus wept, Gardner thought. Start the motherfucking pump, he shrieked, and this time he actually felt, his head fall apart. Closed his eyes. Oh, okay. When he looked up, Enders was gone. Gardner plunged the end of the hose into the glory hole he had cut out from the rock that morning. The water began to bubble slowly, almost contemplatively. It was frigid at first, but his hands quickly became numb. Although the trench he was in was only 40 feet deep, they had removed a whole hillside in the process of cutting a base level, so that the place where Gardner now crouched had probably been, until late June, 90 feet under the earth. Measuring the freeboard surface of the ship would have given not an exact figure. But Gardner didn't give a shit. The simple fact was that they seemed to have nearly reached the aquifer, spongy rock filled with water. Apparently, the bottom half or 2/3 of the ship floating in a large underground lake. His hands were now so numb they had forgotten what they were. "Come on, asshole," he muttered. As if in answer, the hose began to vibrate and wiggle. He couldn't hear the pump's motor from here, but he didn't have to. As the water level in the glory hole dropped, Gardner was able to see his reddened, dripping hands again. He watched as the water level continued to drop. If he hit the aquifer, it's going to slow us down. If we hit the aquifer, it's going to slow us down. Yeah, we might lose a whole day while they figure out some sort of super pump. There might be a delay, but nothing's going to stop them, Guard. Don't you know that? The hose began to emit the sound of a giant soda straw in a giant Coke glass. The glory hole was empty. "Turn it off," he shouted. Enders just went on looking down at him. Gardner sighed and yanked hard on the hose. Enders looked startled, then made a thumb and forefinger circle at Gardner. He disappeared. A few seconds later, the hose stopped vibrating. Then it began to rise, and Enders wound it up. Gardner made sure that the end of it was perfectly still and wouldn't pendulum before he let it go. He now took the radio out of his shirt and turned it on. There was a built-in 10-minute delay. He put the radio in the bottom of the glory hole, then covered it with loose chunks of rock. A lot of explosions force would be channeled upward anyway. But this was powerful stuff. Whatever it was, enough would be left to tear perhaps 3 vertical feet of bedrock into the chunks, which he would quickly load into the sling and power winch up. And the ship would not be hurt. Apparently nothing could do it. Gardner slipped his foot into the sling and shouted, "Pull me up." Nothing happened. "Pull me up, Johnny," he screamed. Once again, there was that feeling that his head was splitting along some rotted mid-seam. Still nothing. His wrist deep plunge into the icy water had dropped Gardner's body temperature perhaps 2 whole degrees. Nonetheless, a damp and slickly unpleasant sweat suddenly sprang out on his forehead. He looked at his wristwatch. 2 minutes had passed since he turned on the Snoopy radio. From his watch, his eyes moved to the loose pile of chunked granite in the glory hole. Plenty of time to yank the rocks out and turn off the radio. Except turning off the radio wouldn't stop whatever was going on inside the radio. He knew that somehow. He looked up for Enders, and Enders wasn't there. "This is how they're getting rid of you, Guard." A drop of sweat ran into his eyes. He brushed it away with the back of his hand. "Enders, hey, Johnny." "Shiny up the rope, Guard. 40 feet, dream on, maybe in college. Maybe not even then." He looked at his watch. 3 minutes. "Yep, this is how. Poof, all gone. A sacrifice to the great ship. A little something to propitiate the Tommyknockers." Started going yet? He looked up so quickly his neck popped, his growing fear turning immediately to rage. I started it almost 5 minutes ago, you fucking shit for brains. Get me out of here before it goes off and blows me sky high. Ender's mouth dropped into an O that was almost comical. He disappeared again, and Gardner was left looking at his watch through what was becoming a blur of sweat. Then the loop around his foot jerked, and a moment later he began to rise. Gardner closed his eyes and clung to the rope. Apparently, he wasn't quite as ready to sniff the pipe as he thought he was. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing to know either. He reached the top of the cut, stepped out, loosened the loop around his foot, and walked over to where Ender stood. Sorry, Ender said, smiling fussily. I thought we'd agreed that you'd give me a shout before Gardner hit him. The thing was done, and Enders was on the ground, his glasses hanging from one ear and his mouth bloody, before Gardner was even wholly aware of what he meant to do. And although he was not telepathic, he thought he could feel every head in Haven suddenly turn toward this place, alert and listening. You left me down there with that thing going, asshole, he said. And if you, or anyone else in this town, ever does it again, you better just leave me down there, do you hear me? Rage dawned in Ender's eyes. He fixed his glasses back in place as well as he could and got to his feet. There was dirt on his bald head. I don't think you know who you're talking to. I know more than you think, Gardner said. Listen, Johnny, and the rest of you, if you're hearing this, and I think you are, you listen too. I want an intercom down there. I want some ordinary fucking consideration. I'm playing square with you. I'm the only one in this town that didn't have to have his brain scrambled to do it either. I want some fucking consideration, do you hear me? Anders looked at him, but Gardner thought he was listening too. Listening to other voices. Gardner waited for their decision. He was too angry to really care much. All right, Anders said softly, pressing the back of his hand against his bloody mouth. You may have a point. We'll put in an intercom, and we'll see that you have a bit more, what did you call it? A contemptuous flick of his smile touched his lips. It was a smile with which Gardner was extremely familiar. It was the way the Arbergs and the McCardles of the world smiled. It was the way the guys who ran the nukes smiled when they talked about atomic power facilities. The word was consideration. You want to remember that. But smart guys can learn, yeah, Johnny? There's a dictionary back at the house. You need it, asshole? He took a step toward Enders and had the distinct satisfaction of seeing the man fall back 2 steps, the contemptuous little smile disappearing. It was replaced with a look of nervy apprehension. Consideration, Johnny, you remember? All of you remember. If not for me, then for Bobbi. They were standing by the equipment lean-to now, Ender's eyes small and nervous, Gardner's large and bloodshot and still angry. And if Bobbi dies, your idea of consideration may extend all the way to a quick and painless death. That's about the size of it, am I right? Would you say that just about describes the topography of this situation, you bald-headed little fuck? We appreciate your plain speaking, Ender said. His lips, with no teeth to back them up, pooched in and out nervously. I bet you do. Perhaps a little plain speaking of our own is in order. He took off his glasses, began to wipe them on the sweaty front of his shirt, an action which Gardner thought would only leave them more smeared than before, and Gardner saw a dirty, furious gleam in his eyes. You don't want to strike out like that, Jim. I advise you. We all advise you. Never do it again. There are changes going on in Haven. No shit. Some of these changes have made people short-tempered. Striking out like that could be, well, a bad mistake. Do sudden noises bother you? Gardner inquired. Anders looked weary. I don't understand your... Because if the timer in your radio is Jake, you're about to hear one. And that radio is Jake, you're about to hear one. He stepped behind the lean-to, not quite running, but by no means lingering. Anders threw a startled glance towards the ship and then ran after him. He tripped over a shovel and went sprawling into the dirt, grabbing at his shin and grimacing. A moment later, a loud, rumbling roar shook the earth. There was a series of those dull yet penetrating, cludding sounds as chunks of rock flew against the ship's hull. Others sprayed into the air, then fell onto the edge of a cut or rattled back into it. Gardner saw one rebound from the ship's hull and bounce an amazing distance. You small-minded, practical joking son of a bitch, Anders shouted. He was still lying on the ground, still clutching his shin. Small-minded hell. You left me down there, Gardner said. Anders glared at him. Gardner stood where he was for a moment, then walked over to him, held out his hand. Come on, Johnny. Time to let bygones be bygones. If Stalin and Roosevelt could cooperate long enough to fight Hitler, I guess we ought to be able to cooperate long enough to unglue the sucker from the ground. What do you say? Anders would say nothing, but after a moment he took Gardner's hand and got up. He brushed sullenly at his clothes, occasionally favoring Gardner with an almost cat-like expression of dislike. Want to go see if we brought in our well yet? Gardner asked. He felt better than he had in days, months, actually, maybe even years. Blowing up at Anders had done him a world of good. What do you mean? Never mind, Gardner said, and went over to the cut alone. He peered down, looking for water, listening for gurgles and splashes. He saw nothing, heard nothing. It seemed they had lucked out again. It suddenly occurred to him that he was standing here with his hands planted on his upper thighs, bent over a 40-foot drop with a man somewhere behind him to whom he had just administered a punch in the mouth. If Anders wanted, he could run up behind me and tumble me into the hole with one hard push, he thought, and heard Anders saying, striking out like that would be a very big mistake. But he didn't look around, and that sense of well-being, absurdly out of place or not, held. He was in a fix, and strapping a rear-view mirror onto his head so he could see who was coming up behind him wasn't going to get him out of it. When he turned around at last, Anders was still by the lean-to, looking at him with that sulky, kicked cat expression. Gardner suspected he had been on the party line again with his fellow mutations. What do you say? Gardner called over to him. There was an edged pleasantness in his voice. There's a lot of broken rock down there. Do we go back to work, or do we air a few more grievances? Anders went into the shed, grabbed a levitation pack they used to move the bigger rocks, and started toward Gardner with it. He held it out. Gardner shouldered the pack. He started back toward the sling, then looked back at Anders. Don't forget to hoist me up when I yell. I won't. Anders' eyes, or perhaps it was only the lenses of his spectacles, were murky. Gardner discovered he didn't really care which. He put his foot on the rope sling and tightened it as Anders went back to the winch. Remember, Johnny, consideration. That's the word for today. John Enders lowered him without saying anything. We're going to stop there for now. But we will continue again tomorrow. And we've got probably 2 readings, maybe. Yeah, probably 2 readings before we get to number 3. So, yeah. But we're going to stop there. I'm going to take a rest. I'm not completely 100%, but I'm getting there. So, we're going to stop there for tonight. And I will talk to y'all later. Thank you for being with me and sticking with me. And I will talk to y'all again soon. I love y'all. Bye.